Most pharaohs left behind temples, statues, and legends, but Ramesses the Great left behind something far stranger. When archaeologists opened the sarcophagus of his daughter, Bintanath, they expected the usual titles: princess, noblewoman, maybe priestess. Instead, they found something no one was ready for. She was called Great Royal Wife, beloved of the king, and right beside those words, daughter of his flesh. Not a metaphor, not a mistranslation, a direct admission that Egypt's most powerful ruler had taken his own daughter as his queen. Why would a man worshipped as a living god make a choice that seems unthinkable today? And why did ancient Egyptian society accept it? The truth goes far beyond one pharaoh, one daughter, or one tomb. Because this wasn't a scandal, it was a system that helped build an empire, and later, quietly destroy it. But before we get to Bintanath, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment the world shaped the boy who would become the most relentless, ambitious, and controversial ruler in Egyptian history, the world that created Ramesses. Long before Ramesses became a legend, Egypt was crawling its way out of chaos. The country was still reeling from Akhenaten's religious experiment, a radical shift that had thrown temples into turmoil and cracked the political structure that held everything together. By the time Ramesses was born, the nation was desperate for stability. His father, Seti I, stepped in as the man who would rebuild Egypt's broken foundations. He restored the temples, revived the rituals, and re-established control over the regions Egypt had almost lost. And from the very beginning, he prepared his son to continue that mission. Ramesses wasn't raised like an ordinary prince. At just 14, he was named co-regent, essentially a king in training. He followed Seti into battle camps, watched the ceremonies priests performed in the holiest sanctuaries, and learned the art of ruling not from books, but from the front lines of power. Reliefs from his youth already show him as a ruler standing beside his father, long before the crown ever touched his head. And all around him, the same message echoed from every temple and every ritual. A pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was the living son of the gods. His blood wasn't just important, it was sacred. That idea would shape Ramesses' entire life, and eventually it would lead him down a path Egypt never questioned, even when it crossed a line that feels unthinkable today. But before that happened, Ramesses had to become more than a prince. He had to become the man who believed his legacy mattered more than anything else, including the rules of nature itself. A pharaoh obsessed with legacy. When Ramesses finally rose to the throne, he didn't just want to rule Egypt. He wanted to dominate its memory. From the moment he put on the crown, he launched a campaign unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Temples were expanded, statues multiplied, and walls from one end of the Nile to the other suddenly echoed with the same name, his. Ramesses carved himself into history with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He built so quickly and so relentlessly that even older monuments were quietly rewritten. If a temple wall once honored a pharaoh from centuries earlier, Ramesses had no problem carving his own name over it, as if he had been part of that story all along. To him, legacy wasn't a luxury, it was a weapon, a way to project godlike authority to his people, to future rulers, and even to foreign powers who feared the shadow of his influence. And behind that obsession lay one core belief. A king's bloodline must remain unbroken, untainted, and unquestionably divine. This wasn't just vanity. In Egyptian ideology, the pharaoh's blood carried the essence of the gods. Lose that purity, and the entire foundation of royal power, rituals, ceremonies, even the right to rule, could collapse. But there was a problem Ramesses couldn't ignore. The number of women considered pure enough to produce a divine heir was shrinking fast. Foreign princesses were useful for diplomacy, but to the priests, they weren't sacred. Even noble women lacked the ritual pedigree needed to stand beside a god-king, which meant Ramesses' pursuit of legacy was slowly cornering him into a choice no modern ruler could justify. Yet in his world, it made perfect sense, and that choice would reshape the royal household in ways no one outside the palace walls ever saw coming. The royal system that made incest normal inside the walls of the Egyptian palace, the rules of family didn't look anything like ours. Ramesses' household was a kingdom of its own, filled with foreign princesses, diplomatic brides, noble women, and eventually more than 100 children. But even with all those options, only a handful of women were considered worthy of standing at the pharaoh's side as a true queen. And that's where the system tightened around him. Foreign wives were politically useful, but they were never fully accepted into the sacred core of Egyptian ritual life. Their blood wasn't divine enough. Their lineage wasn't tied to the gods worshipped in Thebes and Memphis. And as the years went on, the number of local families with suitable prestige dwindled. The pool of eligible queens grew smaller and smaller. But that didn't stop the rituals, didn't stop the ideology, didn't stop the expectation that the king's blood remain untouched by anything lesser. So the system adapted in a way that seems unbelievable today, when outsiders weren't sacred enough. The pharaoh turned inward. His daughters were raised inside the palace, educated in ritual, taught the sacred duties of queenship, and immersed in the mythology that justified everything. Egyptian theology held up the gods Osiris and Isis, siblings who ruled together, as the perfect divine model. And because the pharaoh was seen as the living embodiment of those gods, copying that structure wasn't seen as taboo. It was seen as correct. Inside this ideology, marrying a daughter wasn't a violation. It was a replication of cosmic order. And once that logic took hold, the next step became almost inevitable. Ramesses didn't just marry many women. He married women increasingly closer to his own bloodline, until eventually, his own daughter rose to the position that outsiders could no longer occupy. But she wasn't just any daughter. She was the one girl trained from childhood to become far more than a princess. And her name was Bintanath. Bintanath, child princess turned queen. Bintanath entered the historical record quietly, just a young girl mentioned in the 5th year of Ramesses' reign, identified simply as the daughter of his chief queen, Nefertari. At that point, she was one of many royal children, raised in luxury but with no clear destiny beyond the duties expected of a princess. But almost immediately, something changed. Her name began appearing beside her father in temple scenes. First in small roles, ritual processions, offerings, ceremonial events. Then as the years passed, her titles shifted. She wasn't just a daughter anymore. She was being positioned as something far more central. By her early teens, Bintanath held a role that only a handful of women in Egypt could ever claim. Great royal wife. And the artwork makes it clear this title wasn't symbolic. In the reliefs at Abydos, she stands beside Ramesses as his equal. Not behind him, not below him, but beside the pharaoh, with the same regal stance once reserved for queens like Nefertari. Her clothing, her crown, her posture, everything mirrored the royal wives who came before her. Except now, the woman performing these sacred duties wasn't a foreign bride or a noble woman. She was his own blood, and Egypt didn't hide it. Her sarcophagus openly calls her both great wife of the king and daughter of his flesh, a combination that modern eyes instantly recoil from. Yet in her time, it represented the highest form of dynastic purity. Some evidence even suggests she had a daughter of her own, Bintanath the Younger, depicted on the walls of her tomb. Whether Ramesses was the father remains debated, But the pattern is unmistakable. Bintanath had become part of a system designed to reinforce the royal bloodline at any cost. She wasn't an exception. She was the blueprint. And soon, other princesses would follow the same path, each pulled into the dynastic machinery that demanded the purest lineage Egypt could produce, even when that purity came from within the pharaoh's own family. The other daughters pulled into the system. Bintanath may be the most famous case, but she was far from the only daughter drawn into Ramesses' inner circle. Once the ideology of pure royal blood became the guiding rule of the court, the line between princess and queen blurred, sometimes completely. One of the most striking examples is Meritamen, likely the daughter of Isetnofret. She didn't just receive ceremonial titles or symbolic honors. She was elevated to great royal wife, just like Bintanath. In temple scenes, she stands beside her father with the full regalia of a queen: lotus-shaped crown, elaborate jewelry, and the posture reserved only for women considered divine partners of the pharaoh. Nothing about her depiction suggests she was merely a daughter performing rituals. She was presented as a consort. Then there's Nebetawi, another daughter whose life followed an equally unusual path. She carried both titles, king's daughter and king's wife, a combination meant to reinforce her unique status within the royal household. Her tomb in the Valley of the Queens shows her participating in rituals typically reserved for queens, not princesses. But unlike Bintanath and Meritamen, Nebetawi seems to have stepped out of the royal circle later in life, marrying a high-ranking official instead of remaining tied to her father. Her daughter, Istemak, wasn't given royal titles, clear evidence that the child wasn't of the pharaoh's blood. This fluidity wasn't unusual in Egypt. The title of king's wife wasn't always permanent. A princess could be elevated to queen for ritual reasons, political strategy, or the need to preserve the dynasty's sanctity. And if her role ended because a brother died, a new queen rose, or the court's priorities shifted, she could marry someone else and leave the royal family structure behind. These women weren't caught in romantic entanglements. They were part of a political engine built to sustain the pharaoh's godlike status. Daughters became wives not because Egypt lacked eligible women, but because eligibility was defined by bloodline, not by choice. And for Ramesses, maintaining that sacred line became more important than anything else: power, tradition, or even the long-term stability of his own dynasty. But there was a cost to all of this, a cost that no one in the palace could see until it was too late: the collapse. No one saw coming. For decades, the system Ramesses built looked unstoppable. His building projects dominated the landscape, his military victories were carved into every major temple, and his image appeared so often it felt like he ruled every corner of Egypt at once. But the strength of his reign hid a weakness that had been quietly growing inside the dynasty itself. When power stays locked within one bloodline for too long, something eventually breaks. The signs were there, just not loud enough for anyone to question the king. Earlier pharaohs who practiced in-family unions had left warnings carved into their own bones. Tutankhamun, born of a brother-sister marriage, suffered from skeletal problems, deformities, and the tragic stillbirths of 2 daughters. The Ptolemies, who revived this same royal tradition centuries later, produced unstable rulers whose lineage deteriorated so badly that their dynasty collapsed from the inside. Ramesses' own line wasn't immune. He outlived almost all of his first sons, 12 of them gone before they ever had a chance to rule. The princes who survived long enough to inherit were older, weaker, and unprepared. The man who finally took the throne after him, Merneptah, was already around 60. He hadn't been groomed to rule. He was simply the last viable option. And once Ramesses was gone, the entire illusion of stability vanished with him. The carefully controlled royal bloodline, preserved through daughters who became queens, began to fracture. The genetic risks of generations of close unions mixed with the political consequences of limiting alliances. Without strong heirs, power drifted away from the throne and into the hands of priests, especially those of Amun, who had been accumulating land and influence for decades. Egypt, once unified under Ramesses' overwhelming presence, began splintering into regions ruled by competing elites. The ideology of purity that had held the dynasty together was the same force that weakened it from within. Ramesses believed he could secure his legacy by binding his bloodline into a closed circle. But in the end, the circle became a trap. And what happened next would show exactly what's left when a dynasty builds its future on the belief that only one man's blood is worthy of power. When archaeologists first read the words carved into Bintanath's sarcophagus, it felt like a scandal pulled straight out of a forgotten dynasty. A daughter, elevated to queen, a pharaoh, marrying his own child. But the deeper you go, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't a moment of madness. It was the final expression of a system built on the belief that royal blood was the closest thing on earth to the divine. For Ramesses, purity wasn't about romance or desire. It was a political weapon, one he used to secure the image of an eternal dynasty. But in trying to protect that bloodline, he isolated it, and the very strategy meant to strengthen his empire ultimately weakened the heirs who followed him. Bintanath, Meritamen, Nebetawi. These women weren't just daughters. They were symbols of a kingdom closing in on itself. Their titles, their marriages, their tombs all tell the same story. Egypt tried to preserve its greatness by holding its bloodline too tightly. And instead of securing the future, it suffocated it. Ramesses left behind monuments so massive, they still tower over the desert thousands of years later. Yet his dynasty, shaped by a belief in sacred blood, collapsed almost immediately after his death. In the end, all that remained were names carved in stone, the echoes of rituals meant to keep a god-king eternal. And behind those inscriptions lies a truth more unsettling than any rumor. Sometimes the most powerful empires aren't destroyed by enemies, but by the beliefs they cling to most fiercely. If stories like this fascinate you, hidden histories, forbidden dynasties, and the secrets etched into ancient Adon, there's so much more waiting beneath the surface. Drop a comment if you want me to cover another pharaoh with a controversial past, or a royal family whose secrets were buried deeper than their tombs. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next chapter in the mysteries of ancient power. And tell me in the comments, which ancient dynasty should we expose next?